Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to wait one more minute to make sure that everybody is able to log on before I get started. Okay, it is 12 noon Eastern time, and my name is Sue Shalal, and I am the designated federal officer for the Science Advisory Board Per and Polyfluoroalkyl Substances, PFAS, review panel. At this time in my role as DFO, I'd like to formally open today's public meeting. The PFAS review panel was assembled to review EPA's proposed approaches to the derivation of a maximum contaminant level goal for perfluoric octanoic acid, PFOA, in drinking water, EPA's proposed approaches to the derivation of a draft maximum contaminant level goal for perfluorooctanoate sulfonic acid, PFOS, in drinking water, EPA's analysis of cardiovascular disease risk reduction as a result of reduced PFOA and PFOS exposure in drinking water, and EPA's draft framework for estimating non-cancer health risks associated with mixtures of PFAS. The first meeting of the PFAS review panel was held on December 16th, 2021, where the panel received a briefing on the documents under review, asked clarifying questions, and heard public comments. During today's meeting, the panel will deliberate on the charge questions about EPA's draft framework for estimating non-cancer health risks associated with mixtures of PFAS. The panel is also scheduled to meet on January 6th and 7th, 2022, to deliberate on charge questions related to the other topics I noted earlier. As always, all materials pertaining to this review, including the documents to be reviewed, charge questions, agendas, presentations by EPA representatives, public comments, and other documents as they are developed can be accessed on the SAB webpage associated with this SAB advisory activity. For those listening in today, the panel is meeting via the Zoom video conferencing format, which is being broadcast live through both audio and YouTube video connections. You can find this information by logging in to the SAB website at epa.gov/SAB and clicking on today's meeting date under the heading titled Meetings and Events. And now I'll continue with the administrative remarks. The SAB is an independent expert federal advisory committee chartered under the authority of the Federal Advisory Committee Act, or FACA. The SAB is empowered by the Environmental Research, Development, and Demonstration Authorization Act, or ERDA, to provide advice to the EPA administrator on scientific technical underpinnings of EPA's decisions. FACA and EPA policy require that SAB meetings be announced to the public in the Federal Register and that substantive deliberations and interactions with EPA and the public be conducted in an open session where I, as the DFO, am present to ensure that the requirements of FACA are met. FACA also requires that during public meetings, opportunities for oral and written public comment are provided. During the public comment period on December 16th, we had 4 members of the public who had registered to present oral comments by the deadline noted in the Federal Register, which was December 9th. 3 individuals presented their comments. There's also an opportunity noted on the agenda for today's meeting after the panel deliberations are concluded, where members of the public may request an opportunity to make short 2-minute clarifying comments. I ask the members of the public wishing to make such clarifying comments to send me an email during the break period on today's agenda so that I can add your name to the list of speakers. My email address is shalal.suhair@epa.gov. That's SHALL.suhair@epa.gov. There are also opportunities noted on the agenda for the upcoming January 6th and 7th meetings after the panel deliberations are concluded, where members of the public may again request an opportunity to make short clarifying comments. In addition, members of the public have an opportunity to provide written comments throughout the advisory period. Written comments are distributed to the panel members and posted on the SAB website. Minutes will be prepared to summarize discussions and action items for all of the panel's meetings in accordance with the requirements of FACA, and they will be posted on the SAB website. The SAB consists entirely of special government employees appointed by EPA to their positions, and as government employees, all members are subject to all applicable ethics laws and implementing regulations. The SAB staff office has reviewed confidential disclosure forms submitted by panel members, along with other information related to their involvement in the development of materials related to this advisory activity. EPA has determined that advisors participating in this meeting have no financial conflict of interest or lack of impartiality under ethics regulations specified in 5 CFR 2635 relating to the topic of this meeting. And so with that, I just want to remind folks, remind panel members that there are people who are listening in on a conference line, and I'd like to ask them to identify themselves before they begin speaking. And with that, I will turn the meeting over to Dr. Chu, the chair of the PFAS review panel. Maybe before I do that, I will take roll and make sure that we have everyone online. Dr. Chu, I see you there.
Yes, hello.
Hi. Dr. Boyle. Okay. Dr. Berman.
Yes, hello, I'm here.
Dr. Chen.
Yes, I'm here.
Great. Dr. Corey Slechta.
Hi, yes, I'm here.
Great. Dr. DeWitt.
Hello.
Hi. Dr. Fisher.
I'm here.
Good. Dr. Hammett.
Yes, I'm here.
Dr. Kamendoulis.
I'm here.
Dr. Kaiser.
Here.
Great. Dr. Lipworth.
Here.
Dr. Ma.
Here.
Dr. Olmsted.
I'm here.
Dr. Post.
Here.
Dr. Pullen.
Here.
Great. Dr. Savitz.
Here.
Dr. Slitt. Dr. Slitt, you are on mute. Okay, I see you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Here.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Chu. Thank you.
Hi there, and welcome everyone to the panel members as well as members of EPA and members of the public. The agenda today will be fairly straightforward. We'll first hear from Colleen Flaherty and Justin Conley from EPA, some highlights of the mixtures framework document, just to bring everyone back in focus as to the document we're going to be discussing today. Then we will go in order of the 4 charge questions that were assigned to us to address. Each charge question has an assigned lead discussant who will sort of lead off the discussion, and then they will turn to the other assigned reviewers for that charge question, and then finally to the overall anyone else on the panel who has questions, and then there'll be time for just open discussion about the charge question. After the second charge question, we will take a 15-minute break and then return with charge questions 3 and 4. And then, as Sue mentioned, after the discussion of the 4 charge questions, there'll be a chance for clarifying comments, both from EPA representatives as well as members of the public. And then Dr. Shalal will declare recess at the end. So all the times that are in the agenda are approximate. We have approximately an hour for each charge question. But if it ends early or if it goes over, we will just continue on with the agenda. Are there any questions? If not, then first we'll hear from EPA.
Good afternoon. I'm Colleen Flaherty from EPA's Office of Water. At our last meeting, I presented an overview of the draft framework for estimating non-cancer health risks associated with mixtures of PFAS. We're proposing component-based assessment of PFAS mixtures under an assumption of dose additivity and have posed 4 key charge questions to the Science Advisory Board. The first question is focused on the assumption of dose additivity. Because mode of action data are limited or not available for many PFAS, we are proposing an approach that allows for combination of PFAS with shared common apical effects. And we've asked the panel to comment on the appropriateness of this approach. The remaining 3 questions are focused on each of the component-based methods described in the framework, specifically the hazard index approach, the relative potency factor approach, and the mixture benchmark dose approach. We would like to thank you, the panel, for your review, and we are eager to hear your feedback. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So then we'll just move on to the first charge question. And Dr. Post is the lead discussant, and I'll just read off the charge question briefly. Please comment on the appropriateness of EPA's approach for component, here it is. Component-based mixture evaluation of PFAS under assumption of dose additivity. And second, if a common toxicity endpoint health effect is not considered optimal similarity domain for PFAS with limited or no MOA data, then provide alternative methodologies for integrating chemicals into a component-based mixture evaluation. So with that, Dr. Post, you have the floor.
Thank you, Wei Shui. So I'm going to summarize the responses from panel members on this charge question. And as was said, then each person will have the opportunity to elaborate on their comments. So in total, 7 panel members responded to this question, including the 4 who it was assigned to, as well as 3 additional members. First, I'm going to talk about comments on the assumption of dose additivity. 6 of the panel members who responded about this agreed with the default assumption of dose additivity for evaluating PFAS mixtures, and several of them stated that this assumption is health protective. 1 of the 7 commenters did not agree with this because of, she did not agree with the assumption of dose additivity, stating that there was a lack of information on toxicokinetic mechanisms, and she'll provide additional details during the discussion that follows. Specific additional comments were provided by several of the reviewers. 1 member stated that the recent Office of Research and Development study of developmental effects of PFOA and Pfas supports dose additivity. And this reviewer also said that the assumption of dose additivity can provide an estimate of composite effects even when individual PFAS are below their no observed effect levels, no observed adverse effect levels. 2 members, including me, qualified the recommendation for dose additivity by saying that this assumption should be used as a default when in the absence of data indicating other types of interactions other than additive interactions. And 1 member recommended that EPA reevaluate this approach as additional data become available. 1 member, which was me, noted that the draft mixtures framework document includes a review of studies that indicate dose additivity of PFAS, but it does not include a review of studies that indicate other types of toxicological interactions for PFAS. In my comments, in my written preliminary comments, I summarized some of the in vivo and in vitro PFAS studies that suggest other types of interactions. And I recommended that these studies that don't show dose additivity be discussed. And I said that this would increase the transparency and the characterization of uncertainties associated with the default dose additivity assumption. Now, moving on to comments on use of a similar toxicity endpoint or health effect rather than a common mode of action. 6 reviewers commented on that issue, and all 6 agreed with the use of a similar endpoint or health effect instead of a common mode of action as a default for PFAS mixtures evaluation. Again, individual reviewers provided specific additional comments. 1 reviewer said that this approach based on a common effect rather than common mode of action makes sense because multiple physiological systems and modes of action can contribute to a common health outcome. This reviewer also suggested that the final document should define the difference between a mode of action and a health outcome. 2 reviewers noted that many PFAS, including the 4 that were used as examples in the document and others, have common effects, including developmental, hepatic, and thyroid toxicity. No other approaches were specifically stated, but one reviewer qualified their response by stating that this approach should be used when limited or no mode of action information is available. Another reviewer, which was myself, I noted that the available data indicate that for some PFAS, we have data, particularly for PFOA and PFAS, and also some others, we do have data showing that there are different modes of action for key effects such as hepatic and developmental toxicity, especially regarding whether these effects are totally or primarily PPAR alpha, peroxisome proliferator activated receptor alpha, whether they're dependent on PPAR alpha or independent. And for PFOA and PFAS, there are major differences in regard to this. So I recommended that this information be discussed in the mixtures framework. 2 reviewers noted that the EPA mixtures guidance from the year 2000 provide for an approach based on a common effect rather than a common mode of action. And I noted that the guidance recommended this under specific conditions, including common endpoint, route, and duration, and that it wasn't clear how duration was incorporated into the draft mixtures framework regarding this. I also commented that the toxicity values in the examples in the draft document are all based on animal data because that's what's available right now. But I suggested that EPA should consider how values based on human data could be used along with the values based on animal data in mixtures evaluations. There were also, so that was the comments on the similar toxicity and there were a few additional comments on other issues in response to this charge question. 3 reviewers commented on the potential use of new approach methodologies or NAMS data, such as that high throughput test results or read across results for hazard identification, dose response, and development of screening level toxicity factors. This was mentioned several times in the draft document, and it was stated in the draft document that use of NAMS data to develop toxicity factors is health protective because it allows for consideration of PFAS that are found in the environment that couldn't otherwise be considered because of lack of traditional toxicity data. One member stated in their comments that NAMS approaches are not ready to be used at this time as the basis for human health risk assessment. Another member stated that NAMS data could readily be incorporated into the mixtures framework to support estimating mixtures toxicity, relative potency, and potential risk. And I also commented on this. I agreed that it is health protective to include as many PFAS as possible in the mixtures risk assessment. But the use of NAMS in risk assessment isn't specific to mixtures, and it's equally applicable to chemical by chemical risk assessment. And this is an important issue because for some PFAS that are commonly detected in drinking water, including perfluoropentanoic acid, which is C5, and perfluoroheptanoic acid, which is C7, there's virtually no animal or human data that can be used for risk developing toxicity factors. And additionally relevant to this, EPA has adopted a policy of minimizing animal toxicology studies, despite the obvious importance and the high impact of the few animal studies that have been done recently in ORD, such as the one that's featured in this draft mixtures document on developmental effects of a mixture of PFOA and PFAS. But my point about this is that EPA discussed at the December 16th meeting that it has not developed guidance for using NAMs in risk assessment, and it does not have plans to do this in the near future. And that this use of NAMs in mixtures assessments envisioned by EPA as being more preliminary at this time. This wasn't really clear about the preliminary nature, at least to me, in the draft, and I suggested this be clarified in the final document. And I just had one additional comment regarding EPA's recommendation that toxicity values for PFAS developed by states, quote, undergo independent peer review, end of quote. I said that this recommendation is not specific to mixtures and applies equally to chemical by chemical risk assessment, and that different states have different processes for developing their toxicity factors that are established in legislation, regulation, or by policy, and these may or may not include external peer review. In fact, the toxicity values from a certain state that EPA used as an example in the document as potentially being able to be used in PFAS mixtures assessments, those states' tox factors do not undergo external peer review. In several states, tox factors are recommended by external advisory bodies, which provide external input, but that may not be technically considered to be external peer review. And I guess because I work in a state agency, I was concerned that if EPA put out finalized guidance specifically recommended that state toxicity factors undergo external peer review, this could potentially be used to challenge some state processes. So I suggested the recommendation be made more general and state that there's a need for scientific input in general. So that's my summary of the comments. And I'm going to ask the people who are assigned to this to add anything next. So Dr. Corey Slechta, would you have anything to add?
Great job, Gloria. You have included all of the comments I made. And in particular, I do want to just stress this idea that we are a one human with an integrative physiology, and focusing on health outcomes that are going to reflect multiple systems and molecular pathways. And we need to get to those and away from simple molecular bases. So thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Kamendoulis.
Yep. Thank you, Gloria. You did an excellent job summarizing all of our comments. I appreciate the work you put into that. And I do want to underscore one item, and that is what you mentioned. These are largely understudied chemicals, as we all know. And I think this approach of additivity is health protective. I think in the absence of the information that we have right now, this would be a cautionary approach to take. That's all I have to add.
Thank you. Dr. Slitt.
Hi, Gloria, first of all, thank you for a really excellent summary. And I just would like to kind of maybe temper the language that I used in my review, because I used the word disagree. And I think what I would prefer to say is that when it's unclear that we should still be using the concept of dose additivity, I think my concerns that led me to have some disagreement is that there are really, first of all, PFAS are physiochemically very different than the other types of classes of chemicals that have been studied for dose additivity. And it looks like when we're looking at cell-based studies and also some animal studies, which are very limited, there's some questions about how PFAS interact when they're together. And it's not always clear. There's some recent papers that I cited in which it's not clear that actually when you add more PFAS that it's additive versus or not. So I think my concern is just that we don't really know a lot, and the chemicals are very different in structure. And I think we have to have some proof of concept types of studies that actually give us a basis to understand that when they are put together at environmentally relevant concentrations, whether it's in animal models or cell models and relevant cell models, that they're going to produce an additive effect. I think given, to be health protective, if we don't have that information, it is the better approach to assume additivity. But I think when you start looking, there was a recent publication by Tom Webster in 2022 where they use different approaches, and not all of the approaches for just PPA or alpha signaling kind of show that it's additive. And so I think that's my concern, is that there needs to be some more debate, some more information around the correct study designs to be able to address additivity and show that additivity is actually empirically going to happen with PFAS, instead of making an assumption. It might be reasonable at low doses to think there's an assumption. I think when we start getting into higher concentrations of PFAS, whether it's in cells or animals, there can be a real issue around them competing for transport, and having issues that may not be really relevant at environmentally environmentally relevant concentrations, and that could be confounding itself. So there should be some discussion around showing that dose additivity exists, and then also the proper ways to address dose additivity in correct models. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. Now I'm going to ask the three other members who were not specifically assigned to this question, but who did provide comments, to make any comments. So Dr. Chu.
Thank you, Gloria. I don't have any further comments after your summary, but as other people mentioned, it was a great summary.
Dr. DeWitt.
I don't have any specific comments to add, but in support of what Dr. Slitt said, we did receive public comments highlighting some of the work done by Dr. Webster and his colleagues. So I think it would be important for all of us to review those public comments as we move forward.
Thank you. And Dr. Pullen-Fedenik.
Yeah, thank you. No additional comments. That was a wonderful summary. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So I just want to start the discussion by saying I recommended the approach of dose additivity, the assumption of dose additivity in the absence of data to the contrary, but consistent with what Dr. Slitt and Dr. DeWitt said. I noticed that in the documents, they seem to focus, the discussion of the review of the literature seemed to focus on studies that did show dose additivity. And one of my comments, which I said earlier, was that a total discussion of all information that shows dose additivity and studies that don't show additivity. I recommended that the discussion be expanded to include all of that and not just the ones supporting it, for transparency. And also, even though it's a health protective assumption, to further characterize the level of uncertainty associated with it. So I guess the discussion's open to all members now.
You can either turn your video on or use the raise hand function if any others would like to comment.
Hi, this is Jeff Fisher. I had a comment related to Angela's discussion about additivity, and I agree. I look at this as proportionality. Additivity may work to a certain point, and understanding where it won't work, like higher doses, or when you're going above saturation on a transporter. So I think there are conditions where additivity may make sense, in the absence of information, but also depending on the compounds, and perhaps transporters need to be aware of where transitions may occur. That's my comment.
Does anyone have any information about whether these transitions can happen at environmentally relative exposures? Would anyone like to comment on that?
This is Angela. I can respond to this a little bit because our group has a publication that was in 2021. And what I would say is it's complicated. And in a rodent model with a developmental exposure, not every endpoint we saw was additive. Some were. Tissue concentrations differed depending on whether or not there were numerous, like just a single PFAS or numerous PFAS present in with the dosing paradigm. And so even for being an author, it was a really complicated conclusion for that study. Now, what I would say is that our limitations was that was a 1 milligram per kilogram dose to CD1 mice, pregnant CD1 mice. So the issue is at 1 milligram per kilogram, we may be really, like Dr. Fisher said, just saturating a mechanism. And so it's not my opinion that PFAS are not additive. I think my opinion is that we need to know when they're additive and when they're not. I don't know if it's appropriate to speak about unpublished data. I do think that cells might respond differently at very low concentrations in the correct cell models. And then you might be able to pick up additivity. So it's not that I'm not disagreeing that additivity cannot occur or be useful to model PFAS. I think it's more that we just need to understand which models are relevant to study that additivity and address it. And right now, the issue is when we're working with, for example, the publication with these FAO cells from Webster's group is they're looking at PPAR alpha activation, but these are cells that don't have transporters. So right away, one of the limiting factors is whether or not that PFAS can really get inside well to the cell before it even hits the receptor. And then we have to deal with what's happening with additivity or not at the level of engaging of the nuclear receptor. So again, I think that is possible. I think it's a more it is the more conservative approach if we're worried about modeling health effects. And so in that regard, I think if we don't know, it's better to assume at low doses they're additive. But I think that it would be very useful for us to understand more before we really start modeling this and being able to understand which studies to exclude or include based on what we know. These are just very different than a PCB, how they behave. So I'm sorry, I'm taking up too much time. Stop.
Any other comments?
Hi, this is Jamie. I just wanted to comment that I think that the mixtures document only addresses mixtures approaches for 4 individual PFAS. And if we are waiting for additional data for the thousands of PFAS that are in the environment or that are in use in commerce, then we may never make any decisions. So I support this approach because it is the conservative approach for all of the unevaluated or understudied PFAS that are in the environment.
Anyone else? Anyone else?
Dr. Probabilistic?
Yeah, I just want to respond to something that Angela said, which I guess, I'm not familiar with the study, but did not show additivity in a cell model. Are we truly at the point where we know that's a valid model of what would happen in vivo in terms of additivity? There's a lot more movement and things that go on in vivo before those toxicants ever get to the molecular components that you're talking about. So my concern is putting emphasis on a cell model as opposed to something that we'd see in vivo.
Gloria, can I respond to that?
Sure. I'm trying to
Yeah.
take notes.
So we did, like, our group published a study in 2021 doing single dose PFOA, PFAS, PFHXS, or a combination in pregnant dams and looking at liver outcomes. And our document marks it all was actually cited in this document. And in some aspects of that model, it is correct in that there was a greater effect with all three together than just one. But with that said, that wasn't for every endpoint. So I think what I'm saying is it's very complicated, and there has to be some, and I agree with Dr. DeWitt totally. If we keep on debating this, we won't get anywhere because there are just too many PFAS. So I'm certainly in favor. My wording in my response was too harsh. I really favor this approach when we don't have the right and have enough information. I just think it's useful to have some proof of concept studies out there in vivo to show that there is some dose additivity. That's really all. Okay.
Thank you. That I think probably the majority or most people feel that way, or at least I do. So obviously everyone can revise their preliminary comments for their final comments if you want to clarify exactly what you intended to say. Thanks.
Jamie, you have your hand up?
Yes, I just wanted to correct what I said earlier in that I don't think we should move forward with dose additivity because there's a whole bunch of PFAS that we haven't evaluated and we have to do it because we won't have time to do it all. I think that this approach is appropriate based on the data that we have, based on the science that we have for the PFAS that have been well studied. So having thousands of PFAS that are understudied is not the scientific basis for moving forward, but the data that we have on dose additivity is my understanding of the scientific basis for moving forward that is health protective in spite, even for those PFAS that have not been well studied.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Can I follow up on that? I guess I just wanted to ask if you can kind of maybe further elaborate on the studies that you found, Dr. DeWitt, that showed dose additivity specifically for PFAS.
Oh, I was referring to the studies that have been done that were in the mixtures-based approach, the ones by Dr. Connolly and Dr. Gray and their group.
Okay. Yep, that's right.
Anybody else? I guess nobody else has comments.
Well, so maybe just in terms of, kind of overarching response to the charge question, in terms of the appropriateness of the component-based mixture evaluation of PFAS under assumption of dose additivity, it seems that there's general agreement that this is an appropriate assumption in the absence of data for most PFAS, that for some individual PFAS, there is evidence that they're for dose additivity, but that the literature review that they conduct, or the summary of the literature they conduct, should be more expansive in terms of looking at the studies that don't necessarily support additivity or have found more complicated types of interactions, but that that the panel overall supports this as the default health protective approach, and that of course additional research is needed to better understand the limits of where additivity might break down, as well as confirming that the appropriateness of additivity particularly at environmentally relevant exposures. Does that sound?
That was a really good summary. Thank you.
Any objections? Any? All right.
Yeah.
And then, Dr. Slick, did you have some?
Oh, I was just saying no objections. Sorry.
Okay, great. All right, so that was very efficient. And unless there's any further comment, we can move on to charge question number 2. So here is they're asking for specific feedback on whether the hazard index approach is a reasonable methodology for indicating potential risk associated with mixtures of PFAS, if not to provide an alternative, and then to provide specific feedback as to whether the proposed hazard index methodologies in the framework are scientifically supported for PFAS and for PFAS mixture risk assessment. So Dr. Fisher is the lead discussant for this one. So the floor is yours.
Hello, thanks, Wei Shui. There were 4 people assigned to review this. We got comments from 7. I think, and trying to look at, there were some people that wrote extensively on this, and I'm not going to try to summarize some of their comments. Looking across the comments, perhaps there's cautious agreement in a few cases, agreement in using the hazard index approach for screening and using this methodology for indicating potential risks associated with mixtures of PFAS. But also almost everyone wrote text discussing the challenges, perhaps voicing concerns and asking for clarification how you would implement such an approach. And some of the issues have already been discussed now. Lack of data is a huge issue, actually, and it's an easy calculation to do, but it also has been pointed out, and I was one of them, that this is not a hazard index, it's not a risk assessment method per se. It's a methodology to be used in decision making, and it's been used at Superfund sites for years for non-cancer approaches. I think that's important to know. So it's a difficult, I think, sell using hazard index approach, perhaps strictly in a screening methodology. It might be perceived as okay by the panel. I'll let them say more. 3 panel members mentioned NAMs and to address mixtures. And this is one point I wanted to talk about for a couple minutes. NAMs is potentially a great tool for asking questions about mixtures. And it may help provide a path forward for doing limited animal studies even. So I think addressing mode of action, mechanisms, involvement of transporters could be useful for NAMs. One person, Sandy, I don't think after reading his paragraphs a couple times, he's not convinced it's a good path forward. Now let him discuss that. I'm not a fan of this approach, except as a screening methodology, not as a risk assessment method. And with that, I'm going to stop and call on the people who did respond, including the people assigned to this. So, Sandy, could you start and talk about what you think about this methodology? You wrote extensively on it.
Well, thank you, Jeff. So my comments are more in the nature of qualifiers. I think fundamentally, the mixtures approach is necessary for PFAS, and these methods are evolving. Obviously, EPA is working on those. Many states have adopted variants of this. So in generally, this is probably the path forward. So my qualifying comments really have to do with, I think, Jeff, you hit upon that, is that this is an approach that has been tried for a long time in Superfund, has worked. And as somebody that spent a lot of time in the Superfund program and then more recently in a drinking water program at the state level, I think therein lies the challenge, is that transition from a Superfund tiered approach to applying that to the Safe Drinking Water Act. So a little bit above and beyond the specifics of the charge question. So I definitely support the approach, but it's a question of the practicalities of this and how this document might phase into how the Safe Drinking Water Act is being implemented by states, especially those states that already have state values and are using a mixtures approach. And they're using variants of the screening level approach as well as the TOSHI approach for decision-making purposes. So for many states, this has already been well established and in a regulatory approach, even though PFAS is not regulated, but many states are doing so using state regulations and state values. And also, just as importantly, in risk communication. So, which is, as we all know, that is a very critical aspect of dealing with PFAS. It's just the risk communication aspects, given the unprecedented challenges that PFAS poses. So I think what I'm getting at is more granularity, more nuances would be very beneficial to ensure that this document doesn't end up having a detrimental effect on how states are already regulating or doing their best to regulate mixtures of PFAS in drinking water in context of the Safe Drinking Water Act. So there are some technical complexities which may be difficult for states and public water supplies to overcome using the in particularly as you move from the screening level approach to the TOSHI approach. And then also the fact that these are being categorized as tier 1 approaches, not to be used for decision-making, but really to flag if the situation needs to go to a tier 2 assessment using the relative potency factor approach or other more robust approaches. So those are, I think, new concepts for drinking water programs for the Safe Drinking Water Act. So I think more explanation, more guidance is going to be necessary for this document to sort of be phased in a seamless way and not cause disruptions to how states that do have values that they've enacted either through regulations or are just guidance. Many states are already using a mixtures approach. But again, they seem to fall more into the screening level HI and the TOSHI categories, not so much the RPF. So those distinctions, kind of the tiered hierarchy as you go from screening level HI to TOSHI to RPF, I think those distinctions, how to make that transition, I think more discussions, more details, more specific instructions are probably needed to make this document useful. And again, EPA, I think I asked this question on the December 16 meeting too, and EPA clarified. And also in the document itself, they do mention that this is not intended to be regulatory in nature, it's guidance. But the fact of the matter is, any EPA guidance carries a lot of weight. And if it is not in perfect alignment with the approaches that states are using, then that has just the potential to take us backwards. So that's kind of my my comments are really qualifiers. The approach in general, yes, I think this is the direction that we need to continue to explore. So I hope that adds a little bit more clarity to what I was trying to express in my comments.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to clarify.
So Lisa, would you like to talk about what you think about HI?
Sure. In general, I think this is a reasonable approach to take for mixtures, especially for those that we don't have a wealth of information on. I agree this is a guidance. This is not, as you mentioned, this is not to facilitate or help with risk assessment, but it's more of a screening level approach to try to understand, to try to maybe even categorize, or this might even help identify chemical drivers within mixtures that might be of toxicological concern, and those would be identified for further scientific inquiry. So in general, I agree with the approach. I agree 100% with what Dr. Berman just elucidated to us, that there are a number of challenges, and this needs to be crafted in such a way that it doesn't put us backwards, but moves us forward with mixture sciences. So I guess overall, in general, I agree with the approach. It's very straightforward. You mentioned NAM data yourself, and I think that that could feed into this process rather nicely as well. And again, not for risk assessment purposes, but more for screening and identifying bad actors within this large chemical class.
Thank you. Christy, how about your comments?
Yeah, thank you so much. I also had a question for Dr. Berman as well, just to clarify something that he said. But similar to the other committee members that have commented so far, I also thought that this was a reasonable approach. The one thing that I think that it doesn't take into account is some of the uncertainty and the variability and vulnerability that are associated with, the exposures to PFAS, particularly to mixtures. And so one of the things that I would recommend is also reducing that level, that in a kind of indication of concern, from 1, so less than 1, to less than 0.1. So there is precedent for being able to do that. And so that could even be adjusted further for including, say, NAMs, for example, into the database and determining and identifying the potential toxicity associated with these chemicals. And then I also found that the TOSHI, getting to some of the data limitations, one of the concerns I had about the TOSHI approach was that, it requires a level of information about the chemical substances that seem like they would prohibit its use from a class of chemicals with significant gaps in the database. And so one of the questions I had for Dr. Berman was about states that are utilizing this approach already. So I know that there was an example of a table that had the number of chemicals, for example, that are regulated by the states, but knowing some of the approaches that they're taking and how they're utilizing both the HI or the TOSHI and whether or not that is used in decision making would actually be really helpful in clarifying. And so learning a bit more about that, I think, would also be really useful. Yeah, and then I also thought that as we're thinking about the ways in which we're incorporating or thinking about uncertainty, there are ways, and we'll talk about this in some of the future questions that we're going to talk about over the course of these meetings, to talk about ways in which we might again try to incorporate and make sure that we're accounting for that variability and uncertainty, particularly around mixtures, every step along the way in all of these various processes. So thank you for the time to address this comment.
Sandy, did you want to answer Christy's question? You're muted.
Of course, that will get you every time. But that was a great question, and I think that is one of my concerns. So thank you for actually picking that up. So the TOSHI approach, it comes down to states do have different kind of combinations of PFAS that are prevalent. So it is not an apples to apples situation, which then lends itself to a little bit more complexity too, because if you have a mixtures approach, the current EPA draft really based on just 4, because those have EPA toxicity assessments available, but states have their own assessments, either borrowing from EPA or having conducted their own. And states have really targeted their kind of unique cocktails of PFAS. So Minnesota, for instance, uses really a Toshi approach because there are 6 PFAS for which Minnesota does have information, has developed information. So again, yes, and it's that gradation as you go from the screening level to Toshi, then to the RPF, you're adding more complexity. You need more chemical specific information, you need endpoint information, it gets more specificity, it's more complex. Do all states and public water supplies, will they have the expertise and the ability to do that? I think those are questions that come into play. But if I answered your question, yeah, I think states that not every state uses the Toshi approach. It all comes down to whether states have specific assessment that they have developed that gives them those chemical specific information for their particular combination. So I think that's the one of the challenges will be we don't have the uniform mixture of PFAS of concern across the states. So how do you come up with a one size fits all method that has approaches and information for everyone?
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I mean, a follow-up question though is, more than the approach itself, but how they're used, say by Minnesota, for example, is it flagging individual systems that are in need of, more rapid remediation techniques? Like, what's the use of these, right? Is it actually in decision-making versus a screening? So again, even just from this document overall, I just didn't get a sense of how this is going to be used in any way. And so getting a sense of how states are actually implementing or utilizing either, it could be under drinking water, but even under Superfund, to know what are the ramifications of a document like this and how this then moves, throughout the various states with primacy, for example. So I just wasn't sure if you had thoughts or examples of how they're being used, say in the state that you're in.
No, again, thank you so much for picking up on one of my points and elaborating it excellently. So yes, that's exactly was kind of my point that I perhaps didn't go into details. States are using these for decision making, so they are used to flag systems to require intervention, whether that's treatment or alternate water supply. It is in Minnesota, it's the same level of action needed as an MCL violation would. So, Minnesota follows the exact same process as the MCL violation would. So these are, based on 4 quarters. And if you exceed that hazard index of 1, then you take corrective action. So it is absolutely a decision-making process. It's not a screening, because there is no, at this point, states just don't have that additional degree of information than to go to a tier 2 approach. So they're making decisions for in the interest of public health based on what in this document is really being portrayed as tier 1 levels. Superfund, very different approach. It is a lot more information. You have multiple media involved, soil, groundwater, vapor now. So it's a very different situation where you pick up the flags and you move on, because you do have the ability to do site-specific risk assessments based on exposures and so on, which is simply not the case for PFAS in drinking water. So that is, the potential for the processes, risk communication, decision-making. In Minnesota, the Toshi approach is the basis for legal decisions that have now been institutionalized by courts. So a lot of states, again, there's a spectrum where states are at. It is not a one size fits all situation. And states have, I think states need the flexibility to kind of tailor approaches based on their particular combination of PFAS. And, the other, just the bigger picture of where the states might be at. So there's quite a spectrum there. So which is why I think any kind of guidance will need to have that flexibility to allow states and public water supplies to then continue to evolve in using a mixtures approach, which there is no getting away from that either. So I think in that regard, yes, this document does have a purpose and it gets in the right direction. But there's a lot of details here and which do need to be looked at, and careful discussion to make sure again that we don't end up just muddying the waters and sort of getting in the way of states dealing with PFAS contamination in drinking waters, for which they are as best as they can in protecting public health. So I think that analysis of all of these aspects that you just attributed to how will they actually fit into the current landscape of how states are dealing with mixtures of PFAS in drinking water for decision-making purposes?
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. I mean, one of the things that came across for me, and I'm really happy to have those examples of this, is that it seems overly complex, given the complexity of the chemical universe itself, given the complexity of how, states have to interact with, or the different types of mixtures that are occurring in states, that, taking a more simplified approach that allows, the, say, water operators or, the states themselves to be able to take action quickly on these makes the most sense, rather than trickling down through these increasingly complex, procedures in order to get there. And so just having some of those examples are really helpful. Thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Great discussion. We still have some panel members that wrote in comments. Jamie, could you go next?
I think the comments that I wrote are mostly supportive of what was contained in the document. I merely highlighted that scientific subjectivity and opinion plays a large role in the hazard index approach. And I think that as long as there's transparency in that scientific subjectivity within the document, then we can be assured that the approach is based on the best available science.
Thank you. And Gloria, as a state regulator, I'm sure you have some comments.
Thanks. Well, I'm in the science support part of my state agency, so whether I'm a regulator or not, I'm not 100%
Okay.
sure, but I did have some comments because I work on health-based drinking water risk assessment. Well, one thing, I agreed that the hazard index is appropriate as a screen indicating a need for further evaluation. The TOSHI's more refined, but I think it was already mentioned, one issue with that is that there may not be health effects information for all specific endpoints for the PFAS that are being evaluated. But my other comment has to do with the fact that it's recommended that health-based water concentrations, not reference doses or toxicity factors, be used in these approaches. And developing health-based water concentrations involves both the toxicity factor and choosing the uncertainty factors, which exposure factors for drinking water ingestion, and whether it's for a default adult, the model for a breastfed infant that Minnesota developed that several states have been using, or the infant exposure, how much infants drink, how much pregnant women drink, how much lactating women drink, different exposure assumptions and relative source contributions. And that would be part of the health-based water concentration, and different exposure assumptions are appropriate for different PFAS. For example, PFOA and PFAS are transferred to breast milk, and infants receive higher exposures than other people breastfed infants. So the model that was by Gaden et al., the Minnesota Department of Health model that models the peak exposure to breastfed infants, that would be appropriate for a health-based water concentration for those. But the other PFAS in the example in the draft document, for example, PFBS and GenX, there really isn't any data indicating that they are present in human breast milk, or I don't think animal breast milk either. I may be overstating that, but it's not like transferred greatly the way PFOA and PFAS are. And so different exposure assumptions might be appropriate for the health-based water concentrations for those. So would that need to be taken into account when you're developing an index methodology for these, for health-based water concentrations that use different exposure assumptions? Should it be addressed by EPA in the document? And that's my main comment about that.
Okay. I guess Wei Shui, I open it up to the panel now. If there are questions, comments, if you want to make, you can unmute yourself and show your video. I guess that's what Wei Shui suggested.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up this.
Oh, I forgot to ask
Huh?
you. You were
okay.
You sent
Yeah,
comments. Sorry.
I had a brief comment about instead of, because the recent National Academies Committee for Iris that I was on recommended moving towards probabilistic reference values, which actually do have some relationship to risk in terms of a particular incidence of a particular magnitude of effect. And whether I'm not sure how strongly we would want to really make this recommendation, but it brings up, it could bring sort of additional nuances in terms of how to implement a hazard index approach, and that could be something that EPA consider to include in their document. My other comment was related to the TOSHI again, which is that I guess to make it a little bit clearer, and this probably is applicable to the other charge questions as well, but to kind of be a little bit clear as to what kind of data requirements are needed for each approach, right? So for hazard index, it's, I guess, some sort of reference value. For the TOSHI, they would need sort of a organ-specific reference value, et cetera. For RPF, some sort of point of departure, et cetera. So I guess I think that might help, the maybe regulators and particularly at the state level to better understand like what, how, and also for the assessment, but for those doing the assessments of particular chemicals, what type of information would be needed in those chemical specific assessments, or even from NAMs as to, what would be needed as inputs to the various different approaches. And just from the discussion that we've been having, it seems to me that we could get into an odd situation where the tiers are kind of mixed up, whereas the hazard index uses reference values, right? So those are health-based reference values, or as was mentioned just now, or Gloria just mentioned, the health-based water concentrations. But you could have RPFs that were based on read across or based on NAMs, or just based on in vivo studies for which there isn't an official reference value per se. So then you could get in a situation where you have data for a quote higher tier approach, but you don't have the data for a lower tier approach. So I guess the discussion that Sandeep and Gloria had kind of everything that again could be complicated for the state regulators. And, we don't want to do anything that might undermine what they're trying to do at the state level to protect people from these exposures. So I don't know whether Sandeep or Gloria, you or anyone else, you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it is kind of mixing tiers, and that's been mentioned a few times. As you look at the organ-specific methodology coupled with hazard index, and then the combining of the later methods that we'll talk about. I'm not working in the field, but it was a little confusing for me to draw clear distinctions.
Sandeep?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there has to be the tier structure needs to be sort of one directional where there's a clear increase in the refinement and robustness, and logically, you should really only have information that develops as you go from the screening level to TOSHI to RPF. It should be aligned in a way that states can work their way up, but not be precluded from making decisions even with the screening level data, because that's all they have. And in the case of drinking water, you do need immediate decisions. You don't sort of have the buffer of time and space that you have with the Superfund project. So it is kind of almost a binary yes or no. Either the water is safe to drink or it's not safe to drink. So given that, I think it's important to not have this reversal of the hierarchy where you may end up, just because of the way data is evolving, that you have PODs and other higher level data, but you can't get to your I don't want to call them lower level, but just the more initial stages of getting to the hazard quotients and hazard index, because then it also compounds the other big challenge that I think states have, everybody has, which is the risk communication aspect with PFAS. Just explaining to public water supplies and the public why we have this variety of approaches, different standards across states, variations in state standards and EPA values. So that's an enormous challenge that states have faced, and the states have spent a lot of time and effort sort of explaining that and laying out the different approaches that the states have adopted, and trying to show the underlying common basis and why there's differences as some states have more refined assessments and more data, again, sometimes just because of the combination of PFAS they have. So that is already an issue. And I think if the point that you brought up would just be another complication in the messaging and trying to explain all of these very complicated scientific reasons to general public who just want to know if their water is safe to drink or not.
Thank you. Gloria, you have your
So-
hand up.
As Sandeep said, different states have different approaches. And New Jersey, we were one of the first, well, Minnesota was before us, but among other states, I think we were one of the first to develop standards for PFAS. But in New Jersey right now, we're doing it, we're not using any type of mixtures approach or hazard index for drinking water at this time. I think it's really important that I'm very much in favor of the science moving forward and recommendation and guidance documents being developed, but it's really important that it be clear, very clear, that whether, this is a scientific document presenting potential approaches based on science and what we know now, rather than an actual recommendation that states adopted, then it would have less potential to, as I think Dr. Chu said, undermine states, as long as the purpose and the intent is made very clear by EPA. I think it's whether a states are actually doing that or not at this time. I think it's important to move forward and just make it clear what the intent is for what EPA is putting out.
Well, thank you.
So one possible recommendation I was just thinking of is maybe to get rid of the tiering and just present this more as a menu of different options, each with different data requirements and different advantages and disadvantages, things that might over underestimate risk, and to be less kind of flowcharty about it. I mean, that's something we can consider. As I'd love to get feedback as to what people think about that type of a recommendation.
Okay.
Christy?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if you were asking for feedback on that now, or
Yeah,
we'll talk about
yeah,
that later.
sure.
Yeah, right. No, I actually really
Yeah.
like that approach. I think that the tiered nature of it gives me heartburn because there is, a lot of the issues that we've already discussed, quite a lot in this discussion already. And so I think that if it is presented, like Gloria mentioned, as, a scientific exercise to really try to understand and identify the ways in which we might move forward with mixtures using these various approaches, I think is a really good one. Making it so that they don't flow from one into the other, because it is just an exploration, I think is also a really critical one. So I really like that suggestion.
Thank you. Lisa, you have your hand up.
I actually support that. I think that's a logical way to present the information here, and it would eliminate, as you said, going out of sequence, as it were, and using, maybe even having them presented as, I liked your suggestion also for listing the advantages and disadvantages to each of the approaches. As a summary would be, I think, an excellent tool to have for if people are going to use this document, as you've been talking about. So great discussion so far.
This is Angela.
Yep.
I guess for someone who's less familiar with this type of area, could you kind of tell us what the flow chart might look like instead? I understand what you're saying, but I guess, and I understand why maybe we wouldn't want to sequence one versus the other, but kind of what would it look like?
I guess it would be more like you could start with the data requirements, the information requirements for each approach.
Mm-hmm.
And then, that would guide you to, well, given the data you have, what is the approach that most fits the data that you have, or the information you have. And then, and then you could list out the advantages and disadvantages of each approach, look at those. And if you don't like what you see, then you would, then want to generate the information you could do it the other way, right? Looking at the pros and cons of different options. What is the data that we are seeking so that we can implement this particular approach?
Okay. I think that makes sense.
Jamie?
Yeah, I think Dr. Slitt and I are on the same wavelength today. I was going to ask the same question because I kind of got the overall impression from this document that it was a working document because several approaches were recommended, and it would have helped to have, as you said, the flow chart to help us navigate, to help others navigate through the appropriate approaches for those chemical mixtures that are data rich versus data limited. So good suggestion.
Yeah, I'm not sure we need to write the flowchart for them, but just, but I mean, they're the most familiar with the specific data requirements of the different approaches, and also, the pros, advantages, and disadvantages, and things that might lead to over or underestimating, the hazard. So it's probably more of a reorganization, a reorientation of the information. Jim,
See, James has his. Do you want to make a comment? No.
No.
Yeah, I would like to make a comment on a different topic. I heard Christy mention, and I read in, I think, some of the public comments, the idea that the threshold for a health HI should be perhaps 1/10 or something smaller than 1. And I think that deserves a mention here, just as a matter of logic. The idea is if exposure exceeds a level of concern, then we might be worried. And in cases where there are a large number of compounds in the water, no, we're not counting most of them in the HI calculation. But of course, if we're counting the ones for which the HQ is much bigger than all the ones we're not counting, then it's fine to stick with the threshold of 1. So there's that question of whether the compounds that have been studied are the ones of concern, or whether they're more of a representative sample of the whole universe. So I'd like to suggest a little bit more discussion of that in the document.
Okay.
Christy?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, James. Yeah, I agree with that. I think, and some of the questions we have for the MCLG, I also talk about the mixture assessment factor. Is it the mixture assessment factor, the MAF, that, is being used in the European Union and other places in order to try to understand or to account for, the health effects associated with mixtures, for example. And I think that, if we knew, there are a couple of states that had 150 PFAS, or, there are a large number of PFAS that are already being accounted for in some of the state regulations, that, really, if we're only looking at 4 in this particular example, and I don't know exactly whether or not it should be a 10th or it should be a 5th or it should be, so, deciding what that reduction should be in order to account for that uncertainty, I think it's a critical one. And so 1 is an arbitrary number. And so knowing the arbitrariness of it, and then trying to account for the complexity, the variability, the uncertainty, all of those things in the HI, I think is a critical place to really be thinking about, and adding some additional thinking from the agency on that would be helpful.
I guess maybe Sandeep and Gloria, I guess, what do you all think from a state perspective, the idea of having a threshold that's less than 1? I mean, obviously they wouldn't be mandating or anything, but just as a potential option in this mixtures framework.
It's a valid point, because certainly in terms of the absolute science of it is a valid point, because you're, again, sampling, even with today's analytical methods, are you really detecting everything that's there for PFAS compounds, and you're only working with, of the ones you're detecting, the ones that you have values for. So I think there is that aspect of it, and this is where the balance, we're maybe getting ahead of discussion, but this is where that cost benefit starts to come into play, because if you trip that hazard index of 1, you're taking action, whether that's treatment or replacing the water supply, blending, and then I think there's a great deal of safety factor that comes in, because then your resultant water is really, because you're already dealing with such low values. You're in the parts per trillion for these individual PFAS. For most state values, you're in single digits or teens now. So then your treatment essentially does get you to non-detect for many cases. So you're sort of taking care of the problem, because what you detected drove you to action, and in the bargain you sort of probably got everything else too. So it's kind of that whole Safe Drinking Water Act, treatment technology based element that starts to creep in, though it's not intended to. Right? So these are these complexities, which I think with PFAS more so than with other contaminants will have to be accounted for as this conversation on MCLGs and MCLs proceeds. So yeah, in of itself, that's a very valid point. That is the HI of 1, in of itself, adequate safety. But then when you start looking at the actions that get taken, you do get some additional safety that's being implemented. So again, I think it comes down to what's practical in the field.
So you're saying that because the treatment technologies take care of more than just the ones you've targeted, even the ones without, even the ones without toxicity values, then in a sense, once you trigger the action, you do take care of all those, a lot of the other PFAS.
In a kind of an empirical sense, yes. I mean, I think you can, not everybody sort of test that, but that's a pretty safe assumption. And again, those are refinements that I think states are looking at, is what's in the effluent once you've done treatment, what else are you taking out, and what kind of numbers are you accomplishing, how effective is your treatment. So those discussions are ongoing. It's your, what's practical, how much margin of safety is already built into the state values, and then once you layer on intervention, but then but these things do need to, get quantified more and need to be looked at in more detail. Absolutely.
Also impacts the systems that are flagged. No, so the treatment may remove the PFAS from the systems that are flagged because they have an HI above 1, but for a system that's an HI of 0.9 or 0.5, that doesn't, you're not even triggering the action in the first place. So if we're using it in that way in order to again flag a system, then with having that lower HI then allow you to include more systems that are in need of remediation. Again, you do have to get into the cost part, but the thing we're evaluating here is just like that scientific technical piece, not the risk management, right? So yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Lisa?
Sure. I'd just like to add to the discussion, what we just talked about under question 1 is that the dose additivity approach is already a conservative approach. So I think that should be taken into consideration. And going back to what Christy said, I don't know what type of uncertainty factor or safety factor you would apply. At this point, I would support remaining at a 1. That would be my recommendation. Again, based on dose additivity is already protective.
All right.
I don't really want to express an opinion about 0.1 or 1, or that's not what I wanted to mention here, but I just wanted to make a few comments on some of the bigger topics that especially Sandy brought up and others.
Hey, Gloria, could you wait and let James comment?
Oh, yeah,
Because
sure. I'm
related
sorry.
to this.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, thank you. I was a little confused by Sandeep's comment in that I thought the HI was just a screening device. And then if the HI was bigger than 1, then there would be some assessment whether anything should be done. Because HI is already built to be pretty conservative. Whereas his comment suggested that if the HI is bigger than 1, then action will be taken. And so it's not clear by not calculating the HQ for some of the PFAS, we are underestimating the HI, but it could be we're overestimating the risk for a whole bunch of other reasons.
Yeah, thank you. That's so just to reiterate, I think this came up earlier in the discussion too. And I think one of the factors I stated is that states are using these tools to make decisions because they don't have access to the data or the expertise necessary. And there's also just practicalities in terms of public water supplies need to make decisions, consumers need to know what is going on. So it's not no one's asking the states. So it's not a question of action will be taken, but as a practical necessity and given the absence of other information, other tools, states are making decisions based on cumulative mixtures approach using variants of the screening level HI or the Toshi approach. So that is what's happening in practicality, and that was one of the aspects that I brought up, and others have to. That will this document cause some uncertainty with what states have evolved to out of necessity more than anything else, really. So in practicality, yes, these are getting used to make decisions, not perhaps quite in the way that this document lays this out as a tiered approach, which is more akin to what happens in the Superfund universe. That's a much better established process where you do have a tiered approach, and you kind of have the screening level. If you exceed the screening level, you move on to more specific assessments, and a site cleanup decision at the end it happens after the tiered approach has run its course. But in the drinking water world, the process gets short-circuited because there isn't, for many states and public water supplies, there isn't much else to go on. So they have to make a decision with what they have, which typically is at the either the screening level or the Toshi level. Obviously, more appropriate if you use Toshi and if you keep going to the RPF. But again, the data is simply not there for what a state might have for its most prevalent mix of PFAS, really to use something like the RPF approach or even the Toshi approach. So states are doing what they can for their mixtures of PFAS with what data is available. So it's a practicality question, a risk communication question, and in the end, a conservative public health approach.
I guess I'll just say that this discussion would lead me to, if my recommendation was to talk about using a threshold lower than 1, it should be balanced with some of this discussion saying that if decisions are going to be made based on this, we need to recognize there are a bunch of other reasons the HI is a pretty conservative estimate, or we think it is. So it's not obvious that the factor identified is more important than all the other factors going the other way. Thanks.
Thank you. Gloria.
So I just wanted to say one thing that hasn't been mentioned about the HI and the TOSHI approach is that here it seems like, unless I missed something, where it's just PFAS that are being discussed, but it really applies to all chemical, especially the TOSHI approach, I would say, for all chemicals that have a similar toxic endpoint. And I believe that's in Minnesota. I believe Sandy can confirm or correct me that in Minnesota, this type of an approach is used for as an index for all chemicals that are affect, say, the liver or the thyroid or the kidney or whatever, not just PFAS, all chemicals that Minnesota has toxicity factors that they use for, that are found in drinking water or groundwater. Another thing about, I agree that somebody mentioned there can be a lot other PFAS that we're not seeing in water, and we really don't know because only a certain number of PFAS are included in the methods used for routine drinking water monitoring that drinking water labs use right now. We have been fortunate to work with the chemists at the EPA Office of Research and Development who do non-target analysis and can find PFAS even when there's no standards for them and that aren't, let alone be included in standard methods. And we have learned about PFAS that nobody knew about and no one would ever found that are highly toxic in New Jersey waters from an industrial source that are as toxic as PFOA and PFAS that are present in New Jersey waters that would never have been found without the non-target chemists, researchers. And my last point, I think Sandy mentioned about a treatment technique or that GAC will remove a lot of these chemicals. This has been one of New Jersey's points for many years since before we even knew about PFAS, because we were aware of a lot of, we call them TICs, tentatively identified chemicals, unidentified synthetic organic chemicals at low levels in New Jersey waters many years ago. And many years ago, we wrote a white paper as a potential approach, which is not currently, provided for in regulation, that treatments such as granular activated carbon will remove these as a group, whether you know about the health effects or not, whether you've even identified them or not. And actually, when the New Jersey Drinking Water Quality Institute, our advisory body, made the recommendations for the PFAS MCLs to the commissioner of DEP, although, as I said, we're doing it on a chemical by chemical basis and not considering mixtures of PFAS. Part of the recommendation was an additional benefit that would be that this will, if there's an MCL exceedance in a water system for one of the PFAS that we have an MCL for and GAC is put on, it will remove other contaminants that we know that are unregulated that we might not even know about, that are a lot of organic chemicals are removed by GAC. And the last thing is actually we have our own science advisory board at New Jersey DP, which as one of my responsibilities to serve as the liaison, like Sue is the liaison for ours. We had our public health subcommittee, public health, evaluate treatment and health approaches for addressing water contaminants as a group. And a lot of these issues are discussed in that SAB report that's on the New Jersey DEP website. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we have in Arkansas, but they're alive. Which way?
Any other comments? So I guess in terms of where we are, it seems that there isn't a specific objection to, including hazard index and TOSHI in this, as among the options for doing mixtures assessment. I think it seems like it needs to be recognized that although in, say, the Superfund context, these are used more on a screening basis, that in drinking water, for many states, that these are actually used in decision making and regulatory actions. And so for that reason, and because there's potential for the direction of the tiers to be sort of mixed up, we might recommend to present this more as a menu of different options with different pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages. Let's see. And thereby sort of, ensure that states don't get, that this doesn't sort of undermine the ability of states to do decision making with the available data that they have. And then I think the other point then is there's two other details. One is to maybe they need to reconsider the idea of using health-based water concentrations for hazard index instead of RFDs, for some of the reasons that Gloria mentioned, in terms of that the health-based water concentrations also incorporate potentially different exposure factors in their calculations and not just the toxicity data. Or if it is included, that should be pointed out and maybe discussed as part of the kind of advantages and disadvantages and potential limitations. And then finally, the idea of proposing sort of the hazard index threshold being less than 1, maybe recommending them just noting that as a possible approach to address, uncounted or PFAS that are, or other chemicals for that matter, that are outside of that, for which there aren't sufficient data to include in the calculation, but also, noting the ways in which that might, noting the limitations of that and whether, some of the things that I think Jim mentioned and Lisa mentioned, that additivity may already be conservative, and depending on the sample of chemicals that you take the hazard index that are used to calculate the hazard index, that it might be more or less conservative depending on the relative potency of the sort of non-included chemicals. Does that kind of capture the sense of the committee?
I think so.
All right. Well, so we're ahead of schedule. We could either take a break now and then just come back according to the original sequence of events, or we can press on to charge question 3. Is there a preference?
I suggest taking a quick bio break
Sure.
so we can all stretch our legs.
Okay, sounds good. So we'll have a 15-minute break. We'll be back at then 12:55, or well, I'm in Central Time, so 55 after whatever time zone you're in. So, all right.
Okay.
Thank you. See you in a bit.
Anyone who would like to make clarifying comments later on this afternoon, please do send me an email so that I can add your name to the list of speakers. Thank you.
Oh. Record's on. Oh, my.
Before we start, we should probably check that everyone's back.
This is Angela. I'm back.
Okay. Right.
This is Deborah Corey Slack. I'm back.
All right.
Sandeep Berman, I'm back.
Great.
Chrissy
I
Bowen
see.
Fennick, I'm back. Yeah.
Gloria Post, I'm back.
Great. I see
Fisher
Jim,
back.
Jeff.
Lisa Camandulas is back.
Okay,
This is
Okay.
Dave Kaiser. I'm back.
great. David Savitz, are you back? And then we have Dr. Olmsted, Dr. Ma, Dr. Chen. Hi there.
Jim Hammett, I'm here.
Yep.
I think we can go ahead and get started.
All right, great. So charge question number 3. And this is on the RPF approach. So similar to the previous charge question, provide feedback on whether the RPF approach is a reasonable methodology for estimating risk associated with mixtures of PFAS, and if not, provide an alternative. And then feedback on whether the proposed RPF methodology in the framework is scientifically supported for PFAS mixture risk assessment. And so here, Dr. Slitt is the lead discussant. Take it away. You're on mute.
Sorry, that was the second time I did that today. Okay, so first of all, I guess I just would like to say our discussion of charge question 2 was a really great discussion and kind of, I think, a primer for this question. And so the relative potency factor RPF approach was agreed. So first, I just want to discuss areas of agreement between the panel, and 9 panelists weighed in, and pretty much everyone was in agreement that this was a reasonable methodology for assessing mixtures. 9 reviewers commented on the charge, and they were in agreement. 1 reviewer seemed to be in agreement, but just maybe if Dr. Pullman can kind of, when called upon, just explain your rationale, because it seemed as though you were in agreement, but had some questions about it being a focused approach, kind of maybe focusing more than the hazard index. So perhaps you can weigh in on that. Multiple reviewers commented that they endorsed the RPF approach. They considered it, across the board, people chose the word reasonable, so a reasonable methodology for estimating risk associated with mixtures, and felt that it could be used to assess PFAS. It was also commented that the RPF approach is a more data intensive approach as compared to the hazard index methods, which is useful because this may have a more application because the numerous PFAS that exist. And I think in conversation and what comes through the responses a little bit is the fact that there is a concern that there's so many PFAS. The document does justify and address that we need to really have a framework to address such a large number of PFAS where there aren't a very comprehensive data sets. So secondly, so if that's the first, I guess the overarching issue was really in agreement between the reviewers. There was agreement in the document that there should be more discussion and comparison of the approaches, specifically regarding the similarities and differences between an RPF and other approaches, namely the target organ specific hazard index, or TOSHI. So one reviewer stated, however, it would be helpful if an additional explanation is provided to clarify the conceptual differences between the TOSHI approach and the RPF approach, since both are based on health effect specific values for the individual PFAS and in the PFAS mixture. Another reviewer stated the framework should also summarize when the TOSHI and RPF approach will give essentially the same answer, and to the extent to which consistency is appropriate or inappropriate. And I guess I just want to follow upon that particular statement in regard to the discussion we just had, which it sounds as though the suggestions brought forward by Dr. Chu kind of address this specific issue in the document, where the document kind of maybe, this is now my opinion, but may need to less have the flow chart that kind of flows from one thing to another, but perhaps describes when and which circumstances one should use TOSHI versus a RPF, or what the differences will be, and how those estimates may differ in estimating risk. So again, it appears that there's agreement on expanding the discussion of TOSHI versus RPF and the two of those, and the types of information that would be needed to support those types of modeling exercises, assessment exercises. There were overlapping concerns that the document should increase the discussion rationale and justification with regard to the index chemical selections. There was concern among reviewers that the document would be strengthened to provide a flow chart or process in which the index chemical can be determined. I'll let Dr. Kamandoulas speak to this more, but I thought she astutely raised this point along with Dr. DeWitt, and compared PFOA to PFAS, and noted that depending on which was chosen as an index chemical, your ultimate values would be different. So for that reason, I think there should be some kind of more discussion around this notion of an index chemical and how that chemical, what qualities make one chemical to be selected over another, especially when they both may have, a good amount of supporting data. There was overlapping agreement that the RPF and other methods such as benchmark dosing could yield similar results, and this makes RPF reasonable. And so as the EPA states, this read-across approach might facilitate incorporation of data for PFAS into the component-based methods presented in this framework. So I do believe that the reviewers were favorable that this approach could yield very similar outcomes to other data sets where you have a much more data-rich data set to work off of. There really, I have to say, in going through the reviewing comments, I did not see any obvious areas of disagreement. I think I wouldn't call it disagreement. I think there were times that the reviewers might be either questioning the utility of one approach over another and understanding kind of how one new approach may be better than the other. Lastly, I would just also point out that in the discussion, because we're using the RPF integrates these NAMs, these new approach methods, this does allow us to tackle the numerous PFAS that may be present in drinking water systems. I'll just kind of read off some of the things that I wrote particularly and then move on to calling our reviewers. But basically, my opinion was that the RPF approach is a reasonable methodology for assessing the mixture's toxicology and giving some health protections. The document does a good job of justifying the use of RPF, providing supporting literature that's been used to kind of model and go from using these in vitro models to come up with what that in vitro model finding is to a relative kind of, human equivalent dose. There's kind of, and I also think it's very important that I think we're faced, given the use of animals and kind of strategic initiatives of the EPA, to integrate as many of these new approach methods that we can. And this is really, PFAS are a very, very good class of chemicals to be able to model with. There are concerns about how to do some of those, but I think in general, this is certainly a mixtures approach is important. I think lastly, and this goes along with the previous kind of comments from before, it's just that I think at times understanding the guiding notion behind this document and how these RPFs can be used may be useful to the reader, because not being in this area per se, I understand the utility of the document, but at the same time, it's like it might be benefit from a vision of how this information should be used, could be used for mixtures. With that, I think I'll stop there. And I would like to go on and call on the other assigned reviewers to comment. Please note that I'm probably going to be typing and taking notes as you're speaking. So the first individual I'd like to call upon is Dr. Fisher. I believe you are one of the assigned reviewers.
Okay. I had to find my comments. So I agreed with this methodology. I'm more familiar with thinking about looking at mixtures perhaps with this approach in terms of from a research environment at least. And there's problems with lack of data, and some of the NAMS approaches may help fill some data gaps in that regard, along with animal studies, such as an example we saw in the document of unpublished data, I guess, from EPA. I think I have written that consideration should be taken when looking at dose, length of exposure, route of exposure, animal species, but also pharmacokinetics. And if you're going from animal to human, consider, calculating HED based on pharmacokinetic principles. If the data exist, that would be very useful. The examples they gave as a mixture were called illustrative, and that was okay. But, it's kind of a sample of how it would go, I guess, if you're going to try to do this. And I found that useful. I think one really has to examine the shape of dose response curves to see if you can lump things in a reasonable way. And there could even be tests a priori, dose response adequacy tests, perhaps at some point in the future when you're trying to screen larger data sets. That's it for me, Angela.
Okay, thank you. Let me move on to Dr. Berman next, and then and then Dr. DeWitt, and then I'll open it up to the other panel members.
Thank you, Dr. Slade. So I don't think I have a whole lot more to add. I think, as you said, the earlier discussion on the previous charge question really follows some of the broad concepts here. So RPF, we're moving up that hierarchy or into the higher tier. There is data scarcity. It is obviously scientifically in of itself a valid method, very robust. No questions there. It's again the data constraints and also a certain element of the technical expertise that might be needed to implement this method. So there's some practical constraints and just a broader issue again of using a tiered approach, necessitating that you have to do tier one, then you have to move on to tier two, make a decision. I think we've talked in decoupling that, going away from the flow chart to just giving each of these methods their own position based on the merits of the situation, the data availability, the specifics for the state or the public water supply. So I think that that would really enhance the applicability, utility of this method and the framework document itself. So really, I'm in agreement with the other members on the inherent validity of the method. Just a question of how do we make it a little bit more practicable and useful in the drinking water environment. That's really all I have. Thank you.
Great. Last, Dr. DeWitt.
Thank you, Dr. Slitt. I echo what the other board members have said in terms of the relative potency approach being appropriate for PFAS as a class of chemicals. But I would like to also echo again what Dr. Fisher said about making sure that there is congruence among the shapes of the dose response curves. There's been at least one publication that was not included in the mixtures reference list that suggests that the RPF approach is not appropriate for different subsets of PFAS based on differences in the shapes of dose response curves, but there are scientific ways to use differently shaped dose response curves for the relative potency factor approach that could be considered in this document if there was a flow chart or something put together for the relative strengths and weaknesses of the approach and the types of data that are needed. So I would encourage a revision of this document to include greater transparency, completeness, and maybe a few more references that contrast the relative strengths and weaknesses of this approach as applied to PFAS.
Thank you. That's great. So with that, I want to open this up to the rest of the panel. I know Dr. Kamandoulis, you are one of the experts who weighed in. So if you could go ahead, if you'd be willing to go ahead along, I have a few others. So Dr. Kamandoulis, Dr. Post, and Dr. Pullen. maybe you could go in that order. So go ahead.
Great, thank you. What I wanted to point out, and you already kind of alluded to it in your summary, which was a very nice summary of this questions responses, hinges around the selection of the index chemical. I went through I think it was example that was shown in table 4.7, and if you changed which whether PFOA or PFOS was selected as the index chemical, then your overall mixture ICEC is quite different. So I think the document needs to provide a bit more guidance on how an index chemical, or what makes an index chemical, because doing the math, you can come up with very different results. And this was just a binary mixture. Imagine putting additional chemicals into it. So we could have quite different overall mixture potency factors depending on which chemical is selected as the index. So I'm requesting that EPA provide further guidance in this document about appropriateness of an index chemical and how they're actually selected for a given data set. And that's all I had to offer.
So if I can just make a comment about that too, in agreement, I think one of the things that the EPA has done really well with some of the other documents is provide us almost some criteria about how they included certain publications in their analysis and certain studies. And I almost wonder if that same type of framework of for making that index chemical criteria would be helpful, something where there's some defined maybe criteria that could be weighted. So Dr. Kimadoulis, thank you for that comment. That was great. Dr. Post.
Thank you. I just have a couple comments. One, as I understand it from the document, the RPF approach would be based on a very specific effect, such as decreased offspring body weight or a specific type of effect, whereas the Toshi approach would be based on like developmental effects in general. But it took me a long time to figure that out, and I think that's correct. But it should, if that is what is meant, it really needs to be stated very clearly. And you mentioned, Dr. Slitt, that commenters had said that more of clarification should be given about the difference between Toshi and RPF. And that was like one of my specific comments related to that. It should be very clear to the reader. My only other comment is, I think Dr. Fisher mentioned toxicokinetics and HEDs, but as I understood it from the examples and the tables in the RPF section, they were based on human equivalent doses rather than administered doses, the points of departure that were used, that is. So my comment was that I agreed with this and I supported that they were considering the human equivalent dose, and that the other relative potency factors that are pretty well known for PFAS that have been published and I think are being used in Europe by the researchers from the Netherlands, that are based on benchmark doses for increased liver weight in male rats, but they were published by Bill et al. In 2020. Those are based on administered dose, and don't take toxicokinetic differences into account. And so I thought this EPA approach was an improvement over that. Thank you.
Okay. And lastly, Dr. Pullen.
Yeah, Pullen-Pedenek. Yes, wonderful. I really appreciated your review of this as well, Dr. Slitt. A couple of things that came up for me. One that Gloria just mentioned was really trying to understand the shared endpoint concept for the RPF versus the Toshi versus the HI. And so, again, this is an area that I'm not completely familiar with. So, whether or not it would make sense, or if you can even do so, to take, say, the most sensitive endpoint, regardless of the, say, organ specific or the specific adverse endpoint that you're talking about or thinking about, and looking at it that way and creating an RPF based upon just the most sensitive endpoint, similar to what was happening in the HI. So just a technical question actually that I had. But I also thought it would be helpful to have additional examples. And so the mention of, say, using high throughput technologies or read across or other, types of NAMs, for example, in this particular method, though the illustrative examples that were given in the tables were helpful, it actually didn't get to the meat of whether or not this is a practical example in the real world. And so, as the agency is developing this method, being able to give examples potentially of what it would look like for a data poor chemical, even if they are, again, in some of these, less complex mixtures than what we would see in the real world, being able to wrap my mind around some of what would actually happen in real time would help me evaluate whether or not it seems like a straightforward example or not. And so if you have the points of departure already, it seems like it's pretty easy to do. But if we don't have those, then what does that look like? Does it become more messy? Do you get the index chemical issue that we've already talked about, becomes even more important or, more critical in those discussions? So having more of those examples would be really helpful in evaluating it in the fulsome way that it seems as though we're supposed to be evaluating it.
Thanks. Now I'm worried. I hope my typing isn't so loud when I'm listening. Do any of the other panelists have any comments to add?
Yeah, I do. It's Jim Hammett. I'm confused by this concern about the index chemical because it seems to me the RPF approach assumes the chemicals differ only in their relative potencies. The dose response functions are parallel. And then the choice of index chemical is really pretty much like a choice of unit. You can measure length in inches or centimeters. They're different numbers, but that's because they're using different units. So if you use index chemical 1, then you're measuring everything in equivalent units of index chemical 1. And if you use a different index chemical 2, then all your numbers are in units equivalent to units of index chemical 2. Now, I don't think there's a lot said about what you do once you have these relative potency factors, but you have some sort of an integrated dose, basically assuming that all these compounds have the same effects and they differ only in their toxicity by some constant proportion. So it seemed to me that so essentially you could say this mixture is equivalent to X units of the index chemical by itself. And so it would be useful to choose as an index chemical the one for which you have the best information about the dose response function.
Okay, so along with that, do you have any recommendations or suggestions for the document that could help address that kind of lack of clarity?
Well, perhaps just adding a couple sentences equivalent to what I said would be my suggestion.
Okay.
Maybe saying what this number represents. And I think what it represents is the mixture is assumed to have the same effect as the equivalent concentration of the index chemical. And it's based on the concept that the chemicals all have parallel dose response functions differing only in some constant of proportionality.
Okay. Okay. I'm just going through the document and just making sure that I've gotten that I believe also Dr. Chu, you may have also, do you want to weigh in? You also had put a comment into the document for this question.
Yeah, again, it sort of echoes the previous comments that have been made that for the document to be kind of more clear as to the circumstances in which these will give similar answers. For instance, if say a Toshi was all based on the same specific effect rather than just a more general, like mixing a malformation with a, with a fetal body weight or something, then, and if, the uncertainty factors are the same, and the human equivalent, doses are used for both the reference dose and the RPF calculations, then you'll essentially reproduce the same result, whether you're doing Toshi or RPF. And similarly with the mixture BMD as well. So I think there are cases where these different approaches all converge, and the divergences are maybe not as are more related to like how you're lumping different data sets together, like the specificity with which you require things to be before, how similar. And this I think came up in another comment from someone, maybe actually back in the first charge question, is a better understanding of what does a common endpoint mean, right? And so it seems like in these different approaches, a common endpoint or a common outcome could be defined at different levels of specificity. But if they're all the same level of specificity, you might be getting very similar answers across the different approaches.
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone else on the panel who would like to weigh in before we move on to section B? Okay. Are we okay to move on to section B? Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to reread section B. Excuse me, let me just get to it. Section B was, please provide specific feedback on whether the proposed RPF methodology in the framework is scientifically supported for PFAS mixture risk assessment. And again, kind of reiterating the points from A, it does appear that the reviewers are in agreement that this would be a useful framework for PFAS mixture assessment. It does appear that there probably are some assumptions that need to be kind of addressed. And in particular, there still are some not lingering concerns, but there are just, again, some reviewers did bring up dose additivity. And I would say that was about it. And the reviewers didn't really have there were no discordant comments. It was basically that the reviewers felt in concordance that this would be a reasonable framework for PFAS. As far as my review, the only thing that I mentioned is that as we kind of increase our knowledge about NAMs, we do need to kind of understand how that dose additivity may kind of come together. But I do think that this is a good framework and a really important framework for the numerous PFAS. And I did cite a paper that did compare other frameworks. It's a 2022 paper from Toxicology, Nielsen et al. And again, they tried several different methods, and they did find that for this model, a generalized concentration addition method worked better than using relative potency factor for predicting the mixture effects. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the other reviewers. So just going in order from A, Dr. Fisher, can you please provide any sort of comments about section B?
Okay.
So basically, does the proposed RPF methodology in the framework, is it scientifically supported for PFAS mixture risk assessment? So we're talking about the framework specifically to PFAS.
Right, and there are technical issues, and they've been discussed, and I've mentioned the shape of the dose response curves. There's some limitations, I think, that would develop as more data come in. And one paper talks a bit about that was just mentioned. And I guess that's the only comment I have about the methodology.
Okay. Dr. Berman?
Yes, thank you. So I think we've covered, your summary was excellent. I think we've covered everything. I don't have anything more to add other than, yes, agree that the method is scientifically supported. There are some evolutions that'll naturally occur as far as, data gaps and so on. I think that'll just make it more robust. But again, I think it has its place, not applicable for all situations, but it definitely has kind of its place when data and the circumstances warrant. It is a scientifically supported method.
Great, thank you, Dr. DeWitt.
Yeah, I think I rolled my answer for B into my response for A. So just again, to emphasize that if there are differences in the shape of dose response curves, other than just differences in potency, that there may be some correction factors that need to be applied to use the relative potency factor approach. But I do think that this is a sound scientific approach for evaluation of PFAS mixtures.
Great. Oops. Sorry about that. Thank you. Sorry. Okay. And then I did have other commenters, Dr. Kamandoulis, Dr. Post, Dr. Pullen, and the committee. So Dr. Kamandoulis, did you have any additional comments?
No, I don't at this time.
Thank you. Dr. Post?
I also included my comments on A and B and what I said earlier, so I don't have any additional comments now.
Okay. Dr. Pullen?
Yep, same here, did the same.
Okay. Committee, does the committee have any additional comments about the appropriateness for RPF for PFAS? I'm annotating the question a little bit, but that's the basic question to the group. Might be
So
nice. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I have a comment, which is, so I don't know the dose response literature at all, but it seems to me saying the methodology is scientifically supported in this application is pretty strong. I would maybe say it's a reasonable thing to do because the method assumes the dose response functions are parallel or proportional to one another. And if you don't know anything else, that seems like a pretty reasonable thing to assume. But to say that's scientifically supported would require evidence that that's true, I think.
Okay, I think that's a very valid point to bring up. So can some of the other committee members, do any of the other committee members want to weigh in on Dr. Hammond's comment?
Hey, Dr. Slitt, this is Jamie. I think that some of those concerns are covered somewhat in the document by the use of some of the endpoints that are evaluated and summarized in some of the unpublished and published data by Connolly and Gray, or Gray and Connolly, with respect to the mixtures, looking at some of the developmental effects and some of the developmental effects on the liver. It appears, at least from the data that have been presented, that there is parallel dose response for some of the endpoints that are being considered using the RPF approach. Now, I don't know if these endpoints are applicable to all studies that have been done with mixtures of PFAS or all approaches of the RPF that have been evaluated in published literature, but as presented, it appears that they are parallel. My suggestion would be that if there are instances where there does not appear to be parallel dose response functions for the endpoints being used for RPF, that either a different approach is proposed or a correction factor that could be applied to account for those non-parallel dose response curves be considered in the document.
Okay. Okay, I think that's very good. Does anyone else would like to comment about this specific point? I think this is actually a very specific point, and wording matters. So can I maybe have some other committee members weigh in? Because I think the comment here is the use of language, and I think we all agreed that this was reasonable versus, the terms scientifically strong.
This is Jeff. I tend to agree with Jamie about the document and their examples. And granted, it's a snapshot of information. And in a few years, maybe it's reevaluated. I like the word reasonable, personally. That's my only comment.
Yeah, I think that it's a little confusing because Part A asks whether it's a reasonable methodology for PFAS. And then Part B asks whether it's scientifically supported for PFAS. So there is a subtle difference there. I mean,
yeah.
Well,
okay, so let's go back to scientifically supported.
In the document, it is supported to a degree, right? Within the amount of data that's there, I guess, which makes it reasonable.
I guess it's scientifically supported as a reasonable approach or something like that, right?
Okay.
We're not saying that there's positive data for all PFAS, that this is the scientifically supported approach for all PFAS, but it's given what we know, it's the science supports that it's reasonable to apply, I guess.
Yeah, that's fine.
Christy?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this gets back to me again to the examples. I think that with the examples that were given, it seems scientifically supported, but I would like to be able to see the expansion of those examples in order to understand the ways in which this tool is ultimately being proposed to be used so I think in my mind right now, it still seems like it's in a theoretical space. So it's hard to say whether or not in absolute terms it's scientifically supported. It's also hard to say whether or not it's scientifically supported in just the practical terms and the ways in which, again, the data sources that will be utilized in order to cover, we know to be a universe of chemicals with significant data gaps, what this is going to look like. And so if we're talking about the universe of PFAS versus 3 or 2 very well understood PFAS, that's a very different question. And so it just seems too narrow in the examples that we've been given to really determine that, scientifically supported question and real terms.
Maybe the thing is we could recommend that they recommend that when it's applied, that it should be transparent as to whether there's actual, scientific support for this specific case, for the assumptions that the RPF needs to be used, or whether that support is just a more general reasonable assumption that the RPF would apply. And so when it's being applied in a specific case, to distinguish between cases where it's a reasonable approach given what we know about the PFAS that we've studied in more detail, or whether there's actual chemical specific data for these particular PFAS that it's a valid approach. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. And I think I would just add too that it would be very good. There are some journals that have recently or are very soon putting out special editions on mixtures. And so I do think there will be more data coming out about mixtures. And so it would be nice to see the most thorough review on mixtures for both in cell, in vitro and in vivo models that are available too. Okay, does anyone in the group have any more comments about this question? Okay, I'm handing it back to you.
All right, so I think overall it seems that it is a reason. Everyone agrees it's a reasonable. The RPF is a reasonable approach as one of the menu of options. There is some additional transparency or discussion is needed as to comparison with the other approaches, the specific data requirements, index chemical selection, when they give similar or different results to the other approaches. And then also when using the approach, that there needs to, that the document maybe should advocate for or should suggest or recommend that whether the assumptions are assumed as reasonable or whether there's direct evidence for the dose additivity and parallel dose response curves. And then finally, there needs to be some discussion as to when some of these assumptions are violated, whether alternative approaches to address, for instance, the generalized concentration addition or some correction factors or some other alternative approaches when some of the requirements for the RPF are not satisfied. Does that seem like a reasonable summary?
Yes,
right.
Thank you.
Great. All right, so moving on to charge question number 4. So this is on the mixture BMD approach, essentially the same worded questions. Is it a reasonable methodology for estimating what is in essence a mixture-based point of departure, if not provide an alternative? And then providing specific feedback on whether the proposed mixture BMD methodology is scientifically supported for PFAS mixture risk assessment. And Debbie Corey-Schlechter is the lead discussant, so turn it over to her.
Hi, thank you. I think we are going to hear very much a repeat of what we just heard in the prior charge question. We had 4 reviewers that were assigned to this and a couple other folks that weighed in as well. So with respect to the part A of the question, for the most part, I think there was agreement that this in fact was a reasonable approach to take, although one of the reviewers called it interesting. So I'll let her describe that when it's her turn. I think like what we just heard before, a lot of the responses to part B were in the area of clarification, comparisons, transparency, the same kinds of comments that we heard before. So in general, yes, there was agreement, but also in general, there was a discussion of greater need for comparisons and transparency. I will point out that in both the last and the current charge question, one of the components of the charge question says, if not, please provide an alternative, which we haven't seemed to talk about or focus on. And maybe that's something that needs to be addressed or put into the thinking that this is an approach that's being posited, or even with qualifications, are there in fact other fallbacks or other approaches? They aren't in the answers to these questions. So let me turn it over, I'm going to first call on the folks that were assigned and let them further weigh in on this, and then the folks that also contributed to it. So my own responses were that I felt that, in fact, this was an appropriate and reasonable strategy, and it is supported by what I consider to be the strongest, and that's the in vivo data for going in these kinds of directions. So let me first turn it over to Dr. DeWitt. She was one of the reviewers on this.
And just as your summary, I don't really have anything in addition to add to either elevate this particular approach or criticize this particular approach compared to an HI or an RFP approach. I think it's reasonable, and I think it can be reasonably applied to PFAS mixtures.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to turn it to Dr. Post, who also thought it was reasonable, but also talked about it's in a comparative framework. So Gloria, you want to go ahead?
Thanks. So yes, as Dr. Corey Slechta said, I agreed it appeared to be reasonable, but maybe it's just me and maybe someone else on the panel or from EPA can explain this to me. I asked the same question at the December 16th meeting. I don't really understand how this would be used in practice. It's based on the total, as I understand it, it applies to a certain specific PFAS that are present in defined proportions, and the output, as I understand it, would be a benchmark dose in units of milligrams per kilogram per day for the total concentration of PFAS in the mixture in these proportions. So like I don't understand really how it would be used or what the benchmark what would be compared to what to apply this to see if there's possibly an unacceptable risk. So that's really my comment on it. Maybe someone can clarify this for me, and maybe it's just something I'm missing in understanding it. Also, it was stated that only PODs, points of departure, NOELs, LOELs, or benchmark doses would be needed. And if that's true, it doesn't appear to be based on human equivalent doses as the relative potency factor approach was. I wasn't sure if that was intentional or not, but if that is true, that it's just based on administered doses, that would be a disadvantage, as we discussed during the discussion of the RPF approach. Points of departure based on human equivalent doses are preferred over administered doses. Thanks.
Okay, and then Dr. Pullen-Fednick, if I'm pronouncing that correctly,
Okay.
was the one who, sorry, people have a lot of problems with Corey Slechta too.
Yeah,
so
I get
anyway.
it. Yeah, and it's a married name, so.
Yeah, exactly. Tried to get my husband to just become a Corey and get over it, but so you were the one who called it interesting. So maybe you can elaborate on your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this has been covered in some of the earlier, discussion that we had, especially if this was being used as a tiered approach, and then we were filtering chemicals through these various approaches. The complexity of it felt, overly cumbersome. Again, if what we were trying to ultimately do was to, determine a point of departure or a reference dose for a water system, because similar to Dr. Post, I wasn't clear on what the application of this would be. Then it seems like it's a really, heavily technical, sophisticated methodology that may not be practical or fit for purpose for use on the ground. So I just wasn't sure exactly what was trying to be achieved through it. And so that's why, I kind of went with the interesting moniker for it rather than saying that it seemed as though it was reasonable. I think it could be reasonable. One of the concerns that I also had was, again, about the mention of and the continuous inclusion of the use of NAMs within, as an example of how data gaps could be filled, particularly with the endpoints NAMs, say, especially for thyroid and developmental endpoints, the NAMs right now, and that includes the, computational models, it includes the, say ToxCast and other types of NAMs, that these, are really limited areas in which these tools can be used. And so it's, projecting ahead so far in the future, at least in my mind, that it makes it seem as though read across again as a slightly different situation than some of these other tools, but it also made it feel quite limited. And if you're relying on the NAMs in order to fill the data gaps, then this may be something that creates a bottleneck for whether or not chemicals can ultimately be evaluated. So I think if we move into a menu-based approach rather than a tiered structured approach, I think that would clear up some of the issues that I had to.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for clarifying that. We also had comments from Dr. Chu. If you want to weigh in.
Yeah, they weren't really different than my previous comments on the RPF approach, in terms of comparing across the different approaches. I did, but I'm sure Dr. Hammer will talk about it in his comments. But I did want to reiterate that I did think his calculations were correct in terms of that. It seems very, or at least this seems essentially proportional to the RPF approach. And so, whether, but that wasn't really, but even though it was, given sort of its own separate section, it doesn't actually methodologically seem that different, other than different units.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Hammond, you had several comments about it, including the fact that it's very similar to the RPF approach. Do you want to elaborate on that and tell us more about your comments?
Okay. Actually, I think in light of this conversation, I might even expand them to say the hazard index is also equivalent. But in terms of benchmark dose and the relative potency, it seems like they're doing exactly the same calculation. In one case, it's reciprocal, but they're mathematically related in a very straightforward way. So describing them as different methods strikes me as an exaggeration. They're putting, now it could be that one relies on a different sort of input than the other, but that's a question of how they're applied, nothing to do with their conceptual underpinnings. But really, I'm not positive this at the moment, but we've talked about dose additivity at the beginning, and the hazard index, relative potency, and mixture benchmark dose are all assuming the effect of a mixture is the sum of the effects of each component individually, recognizing that the exposures to each component differ and the potency of each component might differ. But so they're all starting with those which are kind of seem like reasonable first order assumptions, unless you have evidence to do something different. That's the obvious first thing to do. And then they're just putting together that information in different combinations, but they're all quite closely related one to the other. And then the questions are, once you get some, like a mixture BMD or with the RPF, you would say this mixture is equivalent to some dose of the index chemical. Then you can do different things with that. You could have a nonlinear dose response function that you put that equivalent dose into, whereas a hazard index, for example, is just assessing whether the total dose of this mixture exceeds some cutoff or not, and isn't worrying about the shape of the dose response function at any other exposure level. So I'm not quite sure where that goes, except it strikes me that there are a bunch of different methods being put out here, and it's not made clear how much they actually have in common with one another. And the differences between them are pretty subtle, or merit elaboration on how you would use the different methods, why you would use one. Or, for example, if you do have evidence of some nonlinear dose response function, then the HI by itself isn't very good, maybe, but either the other two methods could be put into a nonlinear dose response function to get an estimate of the probability of an effect and magnitude of an effect.
Okay, thank you. Before I open it up, Wei Shui, maybe this is something that EPA could comment on in their clarifying comments, what they were thinking of as the distinctions in application that required them to include all of the above, both of these last two charge questions.
Yeah, I think it might have been in one of the public comments as well, the distinction between using whatever methodology as a sort of in relation to a cutoff, right? Is it above or below a certain level versus as an input to a dose response function in which you're trying to actually estimate an effect size, right? So that, and essentially all of these are weighted averages, right? I mean, you're basically taking the concentrations that you're measuring and doing a weighted average of some sort. And then it's just a matter of whether you're using the reciprocal of the weighted average or the weighted average itself, and then what you're comparing it to, or whether it's an input to a dose response function for, say, an index chemical. So maybe, conceptually that and that gets at what Gloria is saying in terms of the context of use, right? If
Right.
it's because if it's just in this case, I think the mixture BMD is more of a comparison. It's more like doing a hazard index, but using a single number. You have a single mixture BMD, you compare that with the actual concentrations, the total concentration, and see whether it's above or below. Whereas in the RPF, you're doing the same calculation, but you could in theory put it into the dose response function and calculate a size of effect.
Doctor, could you explain this a little more? Because from my reading of the mixtures BMD, it said it would only apply when the specific PFAS are present in the specific proportion. So that means they would all either be higher or lower. So why would you need, because it has to be in the same proportions, not just according to, unless I misunderstood. So that's why I don't understand what the real use of it is. They're all either going to be higher or lower if they have to be present in the same proportions. They either all have to go up or go down.
Right. It's like
so why do you need this whole thing if it has to be present in the same proportions?
Yeah, I think so. The output of the mixture BMD is a benchmark dose in the units of like milligrams of all the different PFAS together.
Right. Milligrams per kilogram per day.
Yeah.
For the total PFAS.
Right. And so then I guess that would be compared to the exposure calculation. And then that will essentially give a margin of exposure, I guess, between the in total PFAS exposure versus the mixture BMD value. So, but I think this was in one of the public comments. It's really just like, is it above or below?
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, or how far above or below is the actual exposure versus the mixture BMD. So.
Okay. Are there any other members of the committee who have comments or questions or want to add to this discussion?
This is Jeff. I'd just like to say the two methodologies were so similar, the BMD and the relative potency, that I was confused and trying to understand, what they're really trying to ask us to talk about or to comment on. So for me, it was a little bit confusing. That's only comment.
Yeah, I think the main difference is that for the RPF, you have an index chemical as you have essentially Pfas or PFOA equivalents. Whereas for the mixture BMD, your index is a pseudochemical. It's a mixture. It's of particular proportions. And you're just looking at essentially dilutions, various levels of dilution of that particular mixture.
Okay. I mean, yeah, talking about it today, I can appreciate that nuance a bit more than when I was reading it and trying to figure it out.
Well, I think it does suggest that more clarity in this would be helpful. More clarity in this discussion and the contrast between the methods would certainly be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any other? Yeah, I saw Christy.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise again that point of the common endpoint. So again, like each of the, in Wei Shui, Dr. Tu mentioned this earlier too, that it changed throughout each of these methods, and it changed tier 2, but became more divergent. And so it was really difficult to wrap my mind around what it is that they were calling a common endpoint and how that might be evaluated. So if you in the BMD method in particular, you had to have it for a very specific, say organ level endpoint. It seemed, I wasn't sure also if they wanted to limit it to the thyroid, liver, and then developmental became much broader. Wasn't actually sure what that even ultimately meant. But really trying to have definitions about what that common endpoint is and why it's changing, or how it's changing, and how it's still consistent with the definition that was used in the mixtures guidance from, I forget even the year that it was, in the 90s or whenever that last guidance was issued as well. So just to raise that point one more time.
Thank you. Any other comments? Okay, I think much like what we heard for charge question 3, what we seem to have heard here is that it is a reasonable approach, and yet it needs more clarification in terms of describing it and its application and how it differs from the other proposed approach, and why that would be something useful. And I'll turn it back over to Wei Shui.
Yeah, I think you essentially summarized what I was going to summarize. So I think, yeah, it does seem like there's a lot of the comments, I think, from RPF and HI probably apply here as well. So, all right. Any overarching comments, I guess, before we move on to the clarifying comments from EPA and the members of the public? Christy?
Yeah, I just had one question also about the timing of the evaluation of this document and the sequencing of what's happening with our overall review. So in a couple of the public comments we got, one of the issues that came up was timing. And so, the MCLG document seemed to be in keeping with the deadlines that the agency has set for itself, but I wasn't sure if the same held true for this document. Again, we've talked about some of the state implications of what happens if EPA publishes something on a very quick timeline, et cetera, versus having the time to develop additional examples or to create or, modify the document itself. Just getting additional clarity on that would be helpful. I mean, if we can't have it, we can't, but it was something that came up for me in reading the document.
Okay, great. Jim?
Yeah, I was wondering about if there would be a way to reorient the document a little bit, as we're just discussing all of the methods we've talked about today are sort of weighted averages of what's available. They might differ, or they might by convention differ in how much similarity they assume over mode of action, endpoint, and things like that. But what could be useful is to say, here are a bunch of different tools that are different ways of taking weighted averages. And one or the other might be more appropriate depending on what sort of information you have about the different components of your mixture. And that would be a way into the document then to say that, you know, if you have in the extreme really rich data on dose response functions for multiple endpoints, then, you know, if those turn out to be proportional, then you could summarize that with RPF. If it's more mixed, you might, I was thinking with the BMD, the mixture BMD, you could use that as a point of departure to just construct a linear dose response function below the BMD. But so partly the difference among the methods depends on what you think you're going to do with it. And the hazard index seems more oriented to, we're just going to have a go, no-go decision. We're going to act or not act based on whether some threshold is crossed. But even there, I think you could easily make the assumption that if you reduce the hazard index from a half in a particular water system, if you reduce it from 1 to a half, you've halved the risk of some bad thing happening, even though that's not really justified, but it's about as justified as taking a linear dose response down from a point of departure. But anyway, the point would be to clarify in what situations which of these different methods might be more useful. And the situation would have to do with what information you have on the mixture and the components of it, I think.
Great, Gloria?
I have a comment or question that I just thought of. The examples provided are based on the Pfas that, you know, EPA currently has final reference doses for, and the draft reference doses in the PFOA and PFAS and CLG documents are very, very low, like orders of magnitude, probably below the reporting levels for commercial or drinking water labs that do drinking water monitoring on a routine basis. So if those types of reference doses are, you know, if MCL is based on those types of health assessments and toxicity factors are adopted, I don't even know how this could be applied, because the standards would be, well, we wouldn't be able to measure them routinely anywhere near those health numbers, and the final standards, which could conceivably be above the report, you know, analytical limits due to cost benefit or other reasons, what might be the enforceable numbers, we don't know. But if we're going in that direction with these very, very low health numbers that are really essentially zero, we'll discuss this more on Thursday. How would these types of approaches even be applicable to that type of situation? I know that they have to use the examples of what's fine at this point, but if we're going in that direction, it raises that question, at least in my mind.
Great. Any other comments? I did have one sort of thought that came to my mind related to the human equivalent doses that Gloria raised, and that it's not clear from, you know, the HI and Toshi whether, I mean, it seems that you would need to have human equivalent doses for those as well when you're deriving reference values, right? Because given the potentially large differences in pharmacokinetics between animals and humans, You wouldn't want to use just a default body weight 3/4 scaling or something like that for deriving reference values that would be used in for HI in Toshi. So it seems that, but I mean, maybe this is something that needs to be emphasized throughout the document, that particularly for PFAS mixtures, being able to calculate the human equivalent dose for whatever toxicity point of departure you're using, including for NAMs, would be an essential part of applying these mixture approaches. Are we agreed on that the human equivalent use of human equivalent doses, particularly in the case of PFAS, is really essential rather than administered?
I agree.
Yep.
Yes.
I'm not sure you can say essential, because if you don't have it, then what do you do?
Yeah, I agree with that, with James. But ideal,
Right.
right?
Yeah. So is ideal.
It's ideal.
Ideal.
But that lack of HEDs, creates a lot of uncertainty. Right? Maybe you could say that way. All right. Any other final comments before we move on to the clarifying comments? All right. If not, then Sue, are you going to manage this section on clarifying comments?
Sure. Very easy to manage. I haven't gotten any requests for clarifying comments. So from the public, at least. And
Okay.
You all have asked questions of the agency, and I guess we can give them an opportunity to let us know if they would like to present any clarifying comments as a result of the discussions that they've heard.
Hi, this is Colleen Flaherty. I just wanted to thank the panel very much for the thoughtful view of our document. Today's discussion very helpful.
Colleen,
and I look forward to seeing
your microphone, I think, is echoing a little bit. If you want to maybe step away a little bit, or
a little garbled. Yeah.
Yes.
Is this better?
A little bit.
Okay, I didn't do anything different. So I was just thanking the panel for their thoughtful feedback. And today's discussion has been very helpful. I think that's helped me understand some of the preliminary comments that you provided, and I look forward to seeing the final comments. It's clear to me that we need to be more careful in our wording and more clear about how and when you use each of the methods. So that is definitely something that hit home with me today. Just a point on the mixture BMD. The way I view that approach is a very site-specific approach. So as people noted, you have to know the proportions of each component in the mixture, and the ultimate point of departure that you develop is unique to that mixture. And then that gets converted to a health-based water concentration. So essentially put into a water concentration value to be compared to the measurement in your sample drinking water system. Clearly that needs more clarification, and we need to better distinguish that from the relative potency factor approach. I think I'd like to offer the floor to my colleagues, Jason Lambert and Earl Gray, to see if they'd like to add anything.
Hey, yeah, thank you again. Excellent, a lot of points this afternoon that I'd noted. Wei Shui, the easy one, everything should be in HED where possible. So whether it's the mixture BMD, whether it's the RPF, whether it's the HI approaches, everything should be in where you don't have actual human data, everything should be converted to HED where possible. So if obviously we did not make that clear in this document, but we will for sure. And so, yeah, and that was another big thing that I heard today was is rather than be in a sequential tiered manner, I heard the panels, kind of leaning towards or suggesting, maybe stating data objectives or needs a priori, and then letting this framework be more of a, kind of fit for purpose menu to decide what you need to evaluate your mixture. So that really resonated with me. So I thank you all for that conversation, as well as being more clear, certainly, about I would say the similarities and, more importantly, the differences between the different methods being proposed. So thank you all for that.
Hi, this is Earl. I just wanted to echo the comments of my two colleagues from EPA on this. I really appreciate the efforts of the committee, and the comments will certainly lead to clarification and a much improved document. And that's my only comment. I thank you all very much for your efforts and continued effort.
Great, thanks. Is there, in terms of the question I think Gloria had about the sequencing and timing of this document relative to the MCLG documents and et cetera, is the timeline for this in parallel, or, I mean, is it in sync with those as was discussed at the last meeting, or is this kind of on a parallel track that can sort of have its own timing, or is it really tied to the MCLG regulatory process timeline? Or if you don't have an answer right now, that's fine too.
I don't have a specific answer other than I believe it's on the same timeline. I would ask Eric Burnison to comment on that. He's on the phone.
Doesn't look like it.
Dr. Chu, I'm not speaking for EPA, obviously, but I think at the last meeting, because the timelines for proposing the MCL, not an MCLG, which obviously,
right.
Or the National Primary Drinking Water Regulation, actually, not. And I believe someone from EPA, maybe Eric Burnison or somebody else, mentioned that like a national primary drinking water regulation can be either an MCL or a treatment technique, and that the mixtures framework could potentially be used in consideration of a treatment technique as to, which would address multiple PFAS. I guess, I don't know too much about it, but that was brought up by EPA at the last call. So maybe that would relate to like the timeline for this, because it's to proposing a national drinking water regulation.
Right. Great. And I think the other major theme that I heard throughout our discussion today was to, make sure that it's something not prescriptive in a way that could, be detrimental to existing state efforts in terms of their own state regulatory processes. So in terms of some of the being careful in terms of the language in the document. So.
Dr. Chu, I do have a request from a member of the public. Okay. Mary Buteau, are you online?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Chu and Dr. Shalal. Just a quick question. You were talking about the commonalities and the methodologies, and I was wondering, is it common or would it be expected for each of the methodologies to produce similar results somewhat of an internal validation? And if they were all significantly different, would that not require additional consideration or comment on each of the methods specifically and what could be causing the divergence?
Yeah, I think in our comments, we would like EPA to be, as I think Jason mentioned, be more clear as to the similarities and differences between the different methods and when and why they might give similar or different results. So I think that would hopefully cover that concern.
Thank you.
Anything else? Well, so we're ending early today, but I will assure you that on Thursday we will not be ending early because we have a lot to cover on Thursday. And Sue, correct me if I'm wrong, if we do run out of time, we can potentially go into the Friday meeting with the MCLG document. Is that, or is it?
We actually do have on the agenda a little bit of time set aside on Friday to continue the discussion from Thursday.
Okay.
But also if we find that on Thursday, we do need to go a little bit over the 5 o'clock Eastern time timeline that we've set for ourselves. And if everyone is willing and able to continue for a little bit longer, we're not gonna spend another 2 hours. It might be an extra half hour to 45 minutes to finish up whatever we feel we need to do.
Right, just so we're not ending in the middle of something.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's a possibility as well.
Great. And I think, this has been a good warm up because I think we've gotten used to sort of the cadence and the rhythm of going through the questions. And we will, I think, probably try to be, as succinct as possible on Thursday when we go through because we have so many questions to go through. But that being said, of course, we don't want to limit discussion and we want to make sure that we do have a common understanding of where the committee stands and have a common understanding as to concordance and discordance in terms of the different points of view. So, right. With that, I guess I want to thank all of the committee members and particularly thank the lead discussants for their great summaries of the comments in each of their charge questions. And I will turn it back to Sue to close out this day's meeting.
Yeah, I want to echo Dr. Chu's acknowledgement of everybody's hard work and very much appreciated. Also, I received a question about summarizing the group's information. If you do want to create some sort of a PowerPoint presentation or if you need to use a table or something of that nature, please send that to me ahead of time and I can share it with our folks that are helping out with putting together the Zoom call and have it be projected as you're speaking. So if that's going to help in the discussion, we can certainly have that, you have that opportunity to do it that way as well. So it's up to you. Just want to do verbal, summarizing as we did today, or if you want to actually create some sort of a PowerPoint presentation or a table or some aid in your presentation, that's also an option for you.
Okay. In terms of the notes that people were taking today, should we send those to you? Or would you like them, or how would, in terms, I know each of the lead discussants was taking notes and potentially trying to, summarize as well. Is that something that?
Yeah, so the idea is now we have our preliminary comments. You all have already sent those. We will set aside some time after we're done on Friday to allow folks to go back and revise their preliminary comments based on the discussions that they've heard. Their individual, comments can be revised. And then we'll send those again to the lead discussants. They will have their own notes from today, as well as the revised comments from the individuals. And it will be their job to then incorporate everything into a single coherent response to the charge that they've been assigned to, so that you have all those elements. I don't need to have your notes. Those notes are for you to use in developing the final response. And I'll actually send out a small pamphlet that we have about the report writing process, and that might help folks that haven't been very familiar with how the SAB, the process of how we actually develop our final reports. It may help you to sort of know the steps that we go through in order to prepare those reports. Gloria, did you have a question?
Do you know the time frame yet for providing our final comments and drafting the summaries yet? Do you know what the time frame would be?
Well, we can discuss that, and folks can give me some feedback as to what you all feel you need in terms of time to do all of that. But again, it's a stepwise progression. So you're working on your own individual comments first, and then once those revised individual comments come to me, I will divide them up into for the lead discussants, and then you'll have another opportunity, period of time for you all to integrate those responses and also share them amongst your teammates to make sure that you've captured their thoughts and their comments appropriately. And once the group has decided that that is indeed their final response, those can come back to me. I will incorporate all of those comments into a single report. It may be 3 reports, since we are actually doing basically 3 reviews. And then we will have another meeting where we will discuss the draft report at that time, in an open session. The public can also provide us their comments on the drafts. They will be shared with the public at least 30 days in advance of a meeting. And then we'll have to revise those as needed based on the discussions during that meeting. So it's a process, and it will take us some time. We can work on timing based on how you all, how much time you think you need. And there is a large volume of work here, so I don't want to, shortchange anything. So we'll take all of that into consideration.
It's a little easier to think about after we've heard all the discussion and comments.
Right.
Right. And so that, I think that pamphlet on report writing would be helpful. And and just to be clear, this isn't, the report is not sort of a blow at blows, he said, she said kind of thing. It's intended to be more of a synthetic synthesis of the whole committee's view on each particular charge question. And if there are some individual comments that are more just from one or a few individuals, that would be specified as some members of the committee also felt blah blah blah, right? But with the emphasis on what the whole consensus was first.
Yes, absolutely. So the idea of what we're striving for is a consensus report, and in so much as there is consensus, that is what we would like to convey in the report. If there are those divergent points of view, we're happy to include those as well. Also, I also wanted to sort of bring attention to the fact that we did also receive a number of public comments over the past few days. And I know that many of you have been reading those and have been thinking about them and including them in your responses, as I've seen the email traffic between members and their development of their responses. So whenever you can, if you're thinking about the responses, please do consider those public comments as well. Okay, are there any questions that I can answer today before we recess? All right, well.
All right. Well, thank you
So
very much.
with that, then we will recess until Thursday, noon Eastern time, same place. And you guys take care.
All right.
Be safe.
Everyone take care.
See you then.
And see you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks again.
Take care.